The screams did not travel far. Out on the open plains, sound was swallowed quickly. Wind tore it apart. Distance buried it. By the time anyone could have heard, there was already nothing left to hear. The cabin stood alone, miles from the nearest settlement. A thin line of smoke rose from its chimney, carrying the scent of bread and wood ash into the morning air. Inside, a woman moved quietly so she would not wake the children. Her hands were rough from labor, her back stiff from years of bending. But this life, hard as it was, felt permanent, familiar, safe enough. She did not see the riders until it was too late. They came without warning, without banners, without mercy. Dark figures exploding from the horizon at full speed. Horses trained to move like extensions of the body. The first sound was not a shout. It was a crack of gunfire and the wet thud of arrows striking flesh. Men fell where they stood, sometimes before they even understood what was happening. The killing was fast. The taking was not. Hands seized hair, arms, clothing. Bodies were ripped from doorways, dragged through dirt, slammed against saddles. Children screamed. Mothers screamed louder. Some fought. Some froze. Some begged in languages their captors did not care to understand. Houses were set ablaze not as an act of rage, but as punctuation, proof that nothing behind mattered anymore. Within minutes, the world these women knew was gone. This was the beginning of Comanche captivity. Not a prison with walls, not a cell with bars, but a long, unmarked road into a life designed to erase who you were and replace it with something you never chose to become. The Comanche did not see themselves as villains. They were not mindless killers. They were a people shaped by conquest, survival, and absolute dominance over the land they controlled. By the early 1800s, they were the most feared power on the North American plains, their territory stretching across vast regions that settlers barely understood, let alone controlled. They were masters of the horse, unmatched in speed and mobility. Their warfare was psychological as much as physical. Raids were not random acts of violence. They were calculated operations meant to secure resources, prestige, and people. Captives mattered, and women mattered most. Men could be killed, livestock stolen, goods traded, but women represented labor, reproduction, and status. A woman taken alive was worth more than a dead enemy. She could work. She could bear children. She could be broken and reshaped into something useful. From the moment a woman was taken, her body no longer belonged to her. The journey into Comanche territory was itself a trial. Many did not survive. Captives were forced to move quickly, often barefoot, over sharp terrain. Their clothes were torn away or discarded. Food was scarce. Water was rationed. Those who slowed the group were beaten. Those who collapsed were sometimes left behind to die. There was no comfort in tears. Crying marked weakness. Weakness invited punishment. Some women watched their children die along the way. Too young to keep up. Too loud to be tolerated. Too fragile for what lay ahead. Infants were sometimes taken and killed simply because they were inconvenient. This was not done in rage. It was done efficiently. Survivors later struggled to describe these moments, not because they forgot, but because the memories never softened. They stayed sharp, immediate, as if happening again every time they were recalled. By the time the captives reached a Comanche camp, they were already stripped of everything recognizable. Hair was often cut, clothing replaced, names discarded. They were given no time to mourn, no space to grieve. They were not allowed to be who they had been. Arrival was not quiet. Camps were places of life, movement, noise, animals, children. And for a captive woman, they were places of exposure. She would be seen by everyone, assessed, discussed, claimed, or traded. There was no privacy. Some women were immediately assigned to individuals. Others were held temporarily, waiting to be exchanged or gifted. In some cases, captives were beaten upon arrival, not out of anger, but to establish dominance, to make escape unthinkable, to make resistance feel pointless. Sexual violence was a reality, but it did not always come immediately. Sometimes it was delayed deliberately. Control was more important than speed. Fear was cultivated slowly, carefully. A woman might be ignored for days, forced to work, forced to watch what happened to others. This waiting often became its own form of torture. Anticipation hollowed people out from the inside. When abuse came, it was often wordless. There were no explanations, no apologies, no acknowledgement of suffering. Pregnancy did not bring mercy. If a woman became pregnant, her value increased, but her autonomy vanished entirely. Her body became a vessel for replacement. Children born from captivity were absorbed into the Comanche world. They did not belong to their mothers in the way they once might have. They belonged to the tribe. If a child was deemed weak, unwanted, or burdensome, it might not survive. Some women were forced back to labor within days of giving birth. Others watched their infants taken away, raised by others, or disappear altogether. And yet, this is where the story grows darker in a different way. Not all women were treated the same. Some adapted. Some learned the language, the customs, the rhythms of life on the plains. Some were married in recognized unions. Some were protected from further abuse. Not out of compassion, but because they had become integrated into the social structure. But integration was not freedom. It was transformation through erasure. To survive, many women had to bury their former selves so deeply they could not be retrieved without breaking apart entirely. They learned not to remember, not to compare, not to hope. Hope was dangerous. Hope led to escape attempts. Escape attempts mourning in a Comanche camp did not arrive gently. There was no quiet awakening, no soft separation between sleep and waking. Life began with movement, horses snorting, children shouting, women rising before the sun. For a captive woman, mourning meant work. It meant being seen. It meant remembering immediately that escape was no longer a concept. It was a fantasy. From the first light of day, labor began. Captive women were expected to prove usefulness quickly. Idleness invited punishment. Weakness invited disposal. They carried water, gathered firewood, processed hides, prepared food, tended animals, and cared for children who were not their own, including sometimes the children of the men who had killed their families. This was not symbolic domination. It was daily, physical, exhausting control. Hands blistered, backs broke. Bodies that were already wounded from capture were pushed beyond endurance. Illness was not an excuse. Injury was not a reason to rest. A woman who could not work was a burden. And burdens did not last long. Beatings were common, but they were rarely explosive. They were measured. A strike delivered calmly carried more terror than rage ever could. Punishment was meant to teach, not vent emotion. Public humiliation was another weapon. Women were sometimes stripped, mocked, or forced to perform labor in front of others while injured or bleeding. This was not cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was theater. A reminder to every captive watching that resistance only deepens suffering. Sexual violence existed alongside this labor, woven into daily life rather than separated from it. There were no safe hours, no guaranteed nights. A woman could be summoned at any time. Refusal was rarely an option, and when attempted, it ended brutally. Some women were assigned to a single man. Others were treated as communal property. In either case, consent did not exist. What existed was endurance. Survivors later described learning how to dissociate, to mentally leave their bodies during abuse, to stare at the sky, to focus on breath, to count heartbeats, anything to make the moment pass. Pregnancy altered the dynamic but did not soften it. A pregnant captive was expected to continue working as long as physically possible. There were no accommodations, no midwives from her own culture. Childbirth occurred in camps, on the move, sometimes alone. Pain was not acknowledged. Complications were fatal. If the child survived and was accepted, the mother's position became more complicated. Her value increased, but her autonomy decreased further. Her child became leverage, a reason to obey, a reason not to flee. If the child was rejected, the loss was absolute. Infanticide did not always look like violence. Sometimes it was neglect, sometimes abandonment, sometimes a quiet decision made without ceremony. The mother was rarely allowed to grieve. Grief was dangerous. Grief meant remembering a self that no longer existed. Some women hardened themselves emotionally. Others broke quietly. Mental collapse was not uncommon. Silence became a survival strategy. Expression was risked. Yet even in this controlled cruelty, hierarchy existed. Women who learned the Comanche language were treated differently. Those who adapted quickly, who adopted dress, customs, and behavior, were sometimes spared the worst punishments. This was not kindness. It was efficiency. Assimilated captives were useful. They could translate. They could teach children. They could bridge worlds. But assimilation came at a cost that never stopped being paid. To assimilate meant killing your past in pieces, letting your original name fade, letting memories lose sharpness, letting faces blur until they were no longer dangerous to recall. Some women became so fully absorbed that later rescuers did not recognize them as captives at all. They were viewed with suspicion, sometimes with hostility. A woman who had survived by adapting was not seen as a victim. She was seen as contaminated. Escape was rare. Escape was almost always fatal. The land itself was an accomplice. Vast, open, unforgiving. A woman who fled faced thirst, exposure, and pursuit by riders who knew the terrain intimately. Those who were caught were punished in ways designed to discourage future attempts. Mutilation was not uncommon, a visible marker of failure, a warning etched into flesh. And yet, some still tried. Desperation overrides fear eventually, especially when captivity stretches from months into years, and years into decades. Some women would rather die running than live one more day without choice. Those who succeeded in escaping often carried injuries that never healed, bodies scarred, minds shattered. Many wandered for days before finding settlements. Some collapsed within sight of safety and died anyway. Survival did not guarantee peace. Rescue did not guarantee relief. When women were recovered through military action or ransom, their return was rarely gentle. They were questioned, examined, sometimes interrogated. Their experiences were filtered through disbelief and moral judgment. Had they resisted enough? Had they tried hard enough to escape? Had they become too comfortable? Women who had borne children were often forced to leave them behind. This moment, more than any beating, more than any assault, destroyed many survivors completely. To be told that freedom required abandoning your child was a cruelty no frontier myth prepared anyone for. Some women refused rescue outright. They stayed, not because they were unscarred, but because they were already broken in a way that made leaving impossible. History struggles with these women. It wants clear victims and clear villains. It does not know what to do with someone who survives by becoming something else. Most women who entered Comanche captivity never left behind a record. They did not write memoirs. They did not give interviews. They did not stand before historians and recount what was done to them. They died quietly, anonymously. Their experiences carried only in bodies that aged too quickly and minds that never truly rested. What we know comes from fragments, broken testimonies, letters dictated years later, statements filtered through translators, editors, ministers, and officials who often chose what the public was allowed to hear. And even those fragments are difficult to read, because trauma does not arrange itself neatly. It repeats, it circles, it contradicts itself. Survivors recall certain moments with unbearable clarity, while entire years dissolved into fog. Some accounts end abruptly, not because the story ended, but because the speaker could not continue. One woman, captured as a young girl, later described how time lost meaning. Seasons blended together. She remembered specific sensations more than events. The weight of hides on her shoulders, the sound of horses at night, the feeling of dirt pressed into her cheek while being held down, faces blurred, names disappeared. She could remember pain more clearly than people. Another survivor spoke of how the hardest part was not the violence, but the waiting, the knowledge that any moment could turn into punishment, that safety never truly existed, that even when nothing was happening, something could happen. This constant anticipation hollowed people out. Some women described themselves years later as feeling empty, as if emotion had been burned away. Others experienced sudden, overwhelming episodes of terror long after captivity ended, triggered by sounds, smells, or silence. Modern readers would recognize these symptoms instantly, but in the 1800s, there was no language for psychological injury. There was only weakness, or hysteria, or moral failure. Many women were blamed for what had been done to them. Editors often removed references to sexual violence before publication. Ministers reframed abuse as hardship. Officials softened language to make captivity seem survivable, even character building. The truth was seen as too destabilizing, because if the truth were fully told, it would challenge the romantic image of westward expansion. It would force people to admit that the frontier was not a place of noble struggle, but a landscape soaked in suffering, especially female suffering. Some women tried to tell the truth anyway. They spoke of repeated assaults, of being shared, of being forced into marriages they did not choose, of watching other captives die slowly from exhaustion or despair, of seeing children beaten until they stopped crying forever. They spoke of moments when they wished to die but didn't, and that survival haunted them more than death ever could have. One recurring theme in these accounts is the loss of identity. Women spoke of forgetting their original names, sometimes permanently. When asked who they were, they hesitated. When asked where they belonged, they could not answer. Belonging to no world was its own punishment. Those who returned to white society often found themselves treated as outsiders. Their speech was different. Their behavior was different. Their silence was unsettling. Some communities regarded them with suspicion, others with pity, few with understanding. A woman who had adapted too well was often viewed as morally compromised. A woman who had children by Comanche men was seen as permanently stained. Her trauma did not earn sympathy. It earned judgment. Some survivors were discouraged from speaking publicly at all. Their stories made people uncomfortable. There are also accounts that never made it into official records. Oral histories passed down through families, whispered rather than written. Stories of women who never returned, who became wives, mothers, and workers within Comanche society. Their origins eventually forgotten even by themselves. These women did not vanish. They were absorbed. And absorption in this context was not salvation. It was survival through erasure. Historians have long debated how to interpret these cases. Some earlier writers framed assimilation as evidence that captivity was not always cruel. Modern scholarship strongly rejects that interpretation. Adaptation does not negate abuse. Bonding does not erase coercion. Choosing to stay does not mean suffering ended. It often means the cost of leaving was even higher. There are also stories of women who resisted assimilation completely, who refused to learn the language, who refused to dress like the tribe, who clung fiercely to their past identities. These women often suffered more. They were punished more frequently, worked harder, protected less. Some were killed. Others died slowly, worn down by exhaustion and grief. There was no winning strategy, only different ways of enduring. Children who grew up watching their mothers in captivity absorbed these lessons early. Silence, compliance, alertness, fear. For women who had daughters in captivity, the terror multiplied. They knew what awaited them. They knew what was coming, and they were powerless to stop it. Some tried to teach their daughters how to endure. Others tried to harden them emotionally. Some tried to prepare them for escape, knowing full well it would likely fail. The helplessness was total. And yet, despite everything, human attachment persisted. Some women formed bonds with other captives, with certain members of the tribe, with children who were not biologically theirs. These bonds complicated rescue efforts. When military forces arrived, some women were physically removed while screaming, not to stay in captivity, but because they were being torn away from children they loved. Witnesses often misinterpreted these moments. They assumed captives had gone native. They did not understand that trauma creates attachments out of necessity, not preference. A woman clinging to a child was not choosing captivity. She was choosing motherhood. The aftermath of rescue was often as destructive as captivity itself. Many women suffered from chronic illness, pain, and psychological distress. Some were unable to reintegrate into society. Some were institutionalized. Some withdrew completely. There was no support, no counseling, no recognition of what they had endured, just silence. History prefers clean endings. But for these women, there was no ending, only continuation. The frontier moved on. Settlements grew. Railroads cut through land that had once been hunting ground and prison alike. The Comanche were defeated, confined, dismantled. But the women who survived captivity carried its legacy quietly, into old age, into death. Their suffering did not end when the raid stopped. It simply became invisible. By the late 19th century, the Comanche world was collapsing. Years of relentless military campaigns, scorched earth tactics, and deliberate destruction of food sources broke the power that had once dominated the plains. Horses were slaughtered, villages burned, bison herds, the lifeblood of Comanche survival, were exterminated on an industrial scale. Disease followed, starvation followed, forced relocation finished what warfare began. The raids ended not with justice, but with exhaustion. Comancheria, once vast and uncontested, was reduced to reservations. Freedom was replaced by confinement, autonomy by dependency. The warriors who had once terrified the frontier were themselves stripped of power and agency. But for the women who had endured captivity, the collapse brought no closure. There was no moment where suffering was acknowledged, no reckoning, no apology. The frontier simply moved on, leaving behind people who no longer fit anywhere. Some women were recovered during the final campaigns. Others emerged years later, released or abandoned as the world around their captors fell apart. Many never returned at all. Their descendants lived on, unaware where their bloodline truly began. Those who did return found society eager to forget. Their stories disrupted the narrative of progress. They complicated the idea of righteous expansion. They exposed the cost paid by bodies that were expected to endure silently, so their voices faded. Some women tried to rebuild lives from fragments. They married. They worked. They raised children in towns that did not want to hear what they had survived. Nightmares followed them. Sudden terror. Long silences. What we would now recognize as trauma was treated as weakness. Some women were institutionalized for behavior that made others uncomfortable. Sudden crying, withdrawal, refusal to speak. Others were labeled unstable, unfit, damaged. Their suffering was medicalized instead of understood. There were no monuments for them, no memorials, no public reckoning with what had been done to them by either side of the frontier war. The Comanche story, too, was simplified, reduced to either noble resistance or savage cruelty, depending on who was telling it. Rarely was it presented as a complex human tragedy where power, survival, and violence collided, and women paid the heaviest price. Acknowledging the suffering of captive women does not require denying Comanche humanity. It requires recognizing that power corrupts regardless of culture, and that systems built on domination inevitably consume the vulnerable. These women were not symbols. They were people. They felt hunger, fear, pain, attachment, loss. They endured years of existence stripped of choice, identity, and safety. And when they finally emerged, if they emerged, they were expected to be grateful, silent, whole. They were none of those things. Some died young, bodies worn down by hardship. Others lived long lives, but never slept peacefully. Some never spoke of their captivity at all, locking the memories away until death carried them out of reach. And history, for a long time, allowed that silence, because silence was easier than truth. The plains themselves remember more than books do. Every trail where captives were driven forward. Every camp where women worked until their hands bled. Every place where screams vanished into open sky. The land absorbed it all. And today, when people speak of the frontier, they speak of courage and opportunity. They speak of expansion and destiny. They rarely speak of the women taken alive. They rarely speak of the children lost. They rarely speak of the lives that ended not in death, but in something worse, a slow erasure. Forgetting does not undo suffering. It only guarantees that suffering will be repeated, rebranded, and justified again. The women who endured Comanche captivity were not weak because they survived. They were strong in ways history never rewarded. And their stories, uncomfortable, unsettling, unresolved, remain buried beneath the myths of the past, waiting for someone to tell them honestly. If you want to hear more of the histories that were silenced, erased, or deliberately forgotten, subscribe. Because the past does not disappear. It waits. And when we refuse to remember it, it finds other ways to return.